Hey everyone, and welcome to the Contemplative Science Podcast. I hope you're really well, wherever you are in the world listening in today. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm joined by co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, mate?
Hey, James. Great to be here, as always.
Yeah, so today our guest is Evan Thompson. Evan is a professor of philosophy at UBC, and author of a number of very cool books, including Waking, Dreaming, Being, and Why I Am Not a Buddhist. His research on embodied cognition, the self, and consciousness has in many ways carved the path for these topics. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, and it's basically brilliant to have him on today. Evan, how are you?
Good, thanks for having me.
So you talk a lot about something called Buddhist exceptionalism. And I wanted to start by asking why you think Buddhism gets an easier run, or why it might appeal intellectually to a greater degree than lots of other spiritual traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so to quickly answer that question, I would say that Buddhism has been very, very successful in modernizing itself. So modernization is a phenomenon that we see across virtually every religious tradition, every so-called world religion, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, etc., Islam. And Buddhism has been very successful at doing that, where that means downplaying, or certain forms of Buddhism have been successful at doing this in certain contexts, where they downplay traditional metaphysical or ritual aspects of Buddhism and emphasize certain Buddhist ideas in a way that represents them as being especially rational and especially empirical according to scientific standards of rationality and empiricism. And so the way that that connects to Buddhist exceptionalism is the very widespread perception in the West, and by that I mean, North America, Europe, Australia, the very widespread perception that Buddhism at its core really fundamentally isn't a religion. It's a first-person science or an inner mind science or a philosophical path or a life therapy. And it's not a religion because it doesn't have the need for a belief in an immortal soul or a creator God, and you don't have to accept anything supernatural to partake in Buddhism as a kind of inner meditative discipline. So that is a very modern rendition of certain aspects of Buddhism that in the history of the formation of what historians call Buddhist modernism, which started it started both in Asia and the West. It started in the West in the form of early scholarship on Buddhist canonical writings, for example, especially in Pali. Western philologists working in places like Oxford, reading those texts and reading into them European Enlightenment ideas of freedom and truth-seeking. So they saw the historical Buddha as represented in these texts as a kind of free thinker that fit with their own European Enlightenment sensibilities. And that was going on in parallel in Asia, in places like Burma and Sri Lanka especially, with a Buddhist reform movement in the context of Christian colonialism, where a very clever move was made where Buddhist teachers made certain kinds of meditative practices more available to lay people, while at the same time mounting this counter-argument against Christianity and European civilization, saying, oh, well, Buddhism is actually really the superior scientific religion, again, because, we don't have a creator God, and we don't believe in an immortal soul, and we believe in the law of cause and effect. So that's just a very, very quick kind of summary of what, in essence, I would say is the answer to your question, which is that that form of Buddhism, which then a number of Westerners, say in the 1950s and 1960s, went to places like India and came under the influence of very charismatic Buddhist teachers who had been steeped in that kind of Buddhist modernist outlook. They brought that back to the West in the 1960s. There was a hunger for that. And so all of that came together into this very successful form of modern Buddhism, which has built into it this idea that I call Buddhist exceptionalism. So what I would say, maybe just to kind of round this off, would be to say that religions always evolve, and religions in the modern world especially have to figure out how they're going to deal with modernity. So that's to be expected, and there's nothing inherently bad or wrong about that. That's just the evolution of culture. So I have no criticism of that. I use the term Buddhist exceptionalism, however, to indicate something that I do think is problematic, which is this, as I see it, distorted idea that Buddhism is somehow unique and special and different in a way that makes it fundamentally different from other religions. Other religions have pursued similar kinds of modernization paths, but they've emphasized other things and done it differently. And it, by other criteria, have been equally successful, you could say. For example, Judaism modernized especially by emphasizing a kind of progressive ethos that involves social justice and social change, and has been very successful at that. Buddhism has been very successful at allying itself with a certain image of science and as being scientific. So when you see it in this broader context, the exceptionalism is distorting. It distorts what Buddhism, how Buddhism should be seen and understood historically. It distorts what science is, and it distorts what religion is. So, I mean, we could talk more about that, but that's
nice.
that in a nutshell is the criticism.
Yeah, because what you effectively have is this like quite funky, at least in Enlightenment terms, ontology and all of these claims like traditional Buddhism would have made, which don't have the monotheistic, you have to have this belief system or you go to hell angle. But nonetheless, they're not something that an Enlightenment secular thinker would get on board with. But given that, and given the fact they have modernized, why can't you say, well, okay, I'm not a traditional Buddhist, but I'm a Buddhist in the modern term, the modern sense of the term. At what stage does that become problematic?
Yeah, you can say that, and I have no objection to people saying that. That's like saying, I'm a secular Jew, or I'm a modern liberal progressive Christian. Unitarianism, to take a very far outlying example, rejects a lot of the traditional core tenets of Christianity, certainly as understood by Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox lights. But, it's a form of religiosity, it's a form of community, it's a form of ritual. I don't see any problem with that at all. The problem comes when either people are ignorant of the history and don't realize that this is a new form of Buddhism. Because part of what Buddhist exceptionalism and Buddhist modernism did, and this is a quintessentially modern move, is it reconstructed Buddhism in modern terms and then projected it back to being the historical essence of the message of the Buddha. And we don't actually know anything about the Buddha as a historical figure. The texts in which his teachings are presented are at several removes from him, and they were orally preserved before they came to be written down. So we know very, very little about the Buddha as a concrete historical figure. Arguably, we know less about the Buddha than we do, say, about Jesus. So it's the projecting of a modern construct back into the... So actually, here's maybe a more pointed way of putting it, is that modern Buddhists often position themselves as negating or denying traditional Buddhism. And the way that they do that is by projecting this modern construct back into the origins of Buddhism as a way of trying to do an end run around the evolving tradition of Buddhism historically in all these different cultures and countries, rather than seeing their own version as just another evolving variant. So I see that. I mean, that's a kind of false consciousness. It's presenting a misrepresentation.
Because in order to make the argument that you're saying that the modern Buddhists are making, they're kind of subtly saying, well, look, the core message of this thing is irreligious. Whereas you're saying, no, that's a modern variation, and if you look at the history, we actually know very little about the Buddha, but it's unlikely he was presenting something that basically was totally satisfying from the perspective of a 21st century secular thinker.
Oh, definitely. And moreover, the idea that what the Buddha as an imagined historical figure said as being the essence of Buddhism that's in essence a fundamentalist idea, because you think that you're getting outside of the evolving tradition back to an essential origin, instead of seeing the tradition and its evolution as actually the, you know, the lifeblood of, you know, whatever Buddhism or Buddhisms, to be plural about it, is going to be. And I mean, we could go more into, you know, some of the specifically philosophical problems with that, which is that, you know, Buddhism as a conceptual system is organized around certain normative or soteriological ideas having to do with liberation and salvation, that are not scientific. I mean, it's not that they're anti-scientific, it's just that they operate in a different conceptual space, in the way that art operates in a different conceptual space from science, in terms of, you know, the aesthetic norms, whatever they may be, that govern any given artistic practice. Those are not scientific in the sense that they're not established by science, they can't be validated by science. You can have a conversation with science, between art and science, that can be very interesting and rich, but it's a good conversation when you don't try to use science to justify art, you use the two practices to illuminate each other. So similarly, in the case of, you know, Buddhism, there are these core ethical soteriological ideas of liberation, awakening, existence as inherently suffering, an impulse to transcendence. These are not, you know, scientific ideas. They're not. They operate in the sphere of values and ethics. And so to think that somehow science would validate them, and that therefore Buddhism would be the scientific religion, that's just conceptually confused.
So that means even sort of modernist takes of Buddhism are going to bring in some of these religious points sort of inescapably, because they're still built around these soteriological ideas. Is that why, I mean, then how does sort of modern Buddhism maybe interface with science, or maybe it shouldn't at all? I mean, one thing I hear you saying right now is that we shouldn't be using science in order to prove sort of modern Buddhist ideas. But is there any way that they can relate? Is there any, in your vision, any way that they can be sort of successfully or...
Right. Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So I see, I mean, there's many different kinds of conversation that could happen between different lineages within Buddhism, and for that matter, different lineages within science. So you know, Buddhism isn't monolithic, science isn't monolithic. So it's always about the particular participants in any given conversation. But I would say that, you know, if I was going to generalize, I would say that the overarching theme or rationale for the conversation would be something like the ethics of knowledge or the ethics of knowing. You know, science is based on certain underlying ideas of what knowledge is, and what, you know, kind of knowledge we should be seeking to acquire, and how we should be thinking of it in terms of, you know, the transformation of the material world. So that comes out of, you know, the whole Enlightenment project. And Buddhism is also more in its philosophical intellectual tradition I'm talking about now, very much concerned with, and this comes out of the Indian context especially, with the nature of knowledge or knowing as a kind of instrument or process for organizing our lives in the right way in the world. So there can be, I think, a very interesting and important conversation between these different systems of knowing, with the different, you know, values that are driving them. Because, you know, to put it this way, you know, knowledge or knowing is in some sense infinite. There's always more to be known. The idea that knowledge would come to an end, you know, is in a way incoherent, I would actually say. But we're finite creatures. So, you know, then the question becomes, well, what should we be striving to know, and how should we be striving to embody it? And there, I think, you know, Buddhism, as an ethical system, can actually have some very important things to say in relation to science, because science has a checkered record on this matter. I mean, you know, we just witnessed the amazing, you know, creation of, you know, world-altering, medical-altering vaccines in a remarkable space of time, and that's
Yeah.
you know, fantastic. The politics of getting them out to everybody is another matter, because the world is under-vaccinated
Yeah.
despite this amazing
Of course.
breakthrough. So that's a fantastic thing. But as we know through history, with the creation of the atom bomb and other things, you know, science has been a servant to incredible destruction. So this larger context, or larger conversation about the ethics of knowing is how I would frame the discussion in very, very general terms between these traditions.
It's so interesting. You immediately go to ethics of knowledge when, you know, you would expect somebody, when they're talking about even modernist takes on Buddhism and science, you think meditation,
Right.
you know, and like what are brain states that have to do with the various practices and styles of trainings and the states and traits that are
Right.
developed through those trainings. But you went straight to sort of an ethics of knowledge, which I find so fascinating. Is there something sort of precarious in this other area that is worth talking about here?
Well, I see the scientific study of meditation as a complicated thing. So, in and of itself, studying the effects of meditative practices on behavior and on states and
Right.
traits,
Yeah.
I don't see anything inherently problematic about that. It can, depending on how the studies are done.
Right. Of course.
The issue that the problematic issue that arises is that this is often done in a decontextualized way. So these kinds of practices are embedded within a larger ethical worldview and in a larger social community. And if you just
Right.
abstract an individual out
Yeah.
and think that the nature of those practices and the effects that they have is revealed by seeing what happens in the brain measured with fMRI or, you know, EEG, you may find significant effects, but interpreting what they are when you've bracketed out this larger context becomes very problematic. So,
Yeah.
you know, the analogy that I use in my book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, is that if you're studying, say, expert performance or expert experience, in the case of, say, like Yo-Yo Ma and his cello playing, well, of course, because he's devoted his life to practice and performance and training, you're going to expect to see, you know, very different activities in his brain in networks involving, you know, musical cognition and you know, motor enactment than you would from, let's say, or average or ordinary cello player, or someone who can't play the cello at all. And those are real robust effects, and, you know, that can be interesting. But if you think that doing that informs you as to what the true nature of music is, or cello playing, or Bach, which you can't understand unless you understand, you know, Lutheranism and, you know, conventions of Baroque music. I mean, so I see meditation as like that. Meditation is a practice, it's a skill, but its meaning is not to be found inside the brain, despite whatever, you know, very robust effects you might find in the brain on the part of, say, expert meditators.
There's a couple of things that come to mind. The first is, her name escapes me, but there was a chess player, Polgarth, I think is her last name, and she's the best ever female chess player. And they put her in a scan to see what would happen to her brain when different stimulus was presented. So they put the photo of her family, and the brain recognition patterns light up. And then they show her pictures of her friends, same deal. And then they show her common chess structures, and the same part of her brain lights up, which is unusual, because that's usually pattern recognition for faces, etc. Okay, we don't read in any epistemology or any, like, you understand the true nature of reality from that. But, and I was going to mention this earlier when it came to why Buddhism might have an easier run, meditation itself, especially when you're just on the breath, and it's nothing fancier than that, feels minimalistic. And the lack of content makes you feel somehow, like, superficially, like you're really getting to the core thing. Playing the piano feels superficial comparatively. Playing chess, it's like, well, these are constructed games. Whereas just the nature of meditation, breath, body calming down, I think just has this aesthetic of you're getting to something really spiritually significant. And I'm so interested to hear you say, well, look, people's brains change all the time when they do stuff that's...
Right.
When they
So
do stuff that's... Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a couple interesting things you said. So I would say that for people who are adept piano players, cello players, chess players, a lot of the same absorption that one might experience in, say, awareness of breath meditation is likely to happen in those practices as well. Number one. Number two, the idea that those practices are constructed and meditation isn't constructed, I think, is an illusion. I think, meditation is a scripted practice. It's ritual in the sense that you put yourself into a somatic and mental set that is about, it's a kind of, as if structure. You're putting yourself into a certain context of practice in order to enact something that, meets with an instruction you've been given, or has to do with the larger framework of, say, awakening. And if you go on a meditation retreat and it's a social practice, there's all sorts of scripted and constructed things. So the idea that it's minimalist, it is minimalist in one sense, in that you're sitting, you're not moving, you're paying attention to your breath, you're slowing things down metabolically. That has, calming effects. For some people, it can be anxiety inducing for others, but depending on who they are. But, it has kind of down regulation effects, you could say. So you could say it's minimalist in that way, but it's within a context, a larger context that is very constructed. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, we human beings are social, cultural animals, and we construct context for ourselves in order to create certain kinds of, psychosomatic states. But this idea that when you're meditating, you're kind of turning off construction and you're tapping into something that's deeply there and unconstructed. Of course, there is that, you could say, rhetoric and philosophical framing in the case of certain meditative traditions, but it's in contradiction with what's actually happening on the ground, as it were. And again, my point is not to say here that you can't tap into deeper, more profound sources of, experiential well-being and meditation through doing these practices. But the idea that you're somehow stepping outside of a constructed context, I think, it's rhetoric, and it's an illusion. It's just not actually what's happening.
I was hoping we'd get a chance to talk about this because I've just read a recent paper of yours on concepts and having non-conceptual experience. And it just always hits my ear funny to think that we could have a non-conceptual experience. Partially that's because of the bias of the sort of cognitive science frameworks I'm used to working in, where we think of perception, all perception now, as somewhat constructed. That's just what perception is. It's a constructed phenomenon. So I don't know what it would mean to have a non-constructed phenomenon. So could you just say a little bit more about this sort of debate about the idea that we can have sort of a non-conceptual experience versus a conceptual experience?
Yeah. So this is a huge topic.
We don't have to go too far, but
right.
I've been hoping we could talk about it a little.
It's a huge topic in Buddhist philosophy. It's a huge topic across Indian philosophy. It's a huge topic in philosophy of mind today and cognitive science. But the basic, you could say, an underlying premise, kind of, you could say it's an intellectual premise, a conceptual premise of Buddhist thinking, is that the mind engages in constructive activities.
Right.
And there is, now this is going to depend on who you ask philosophically or in the tradition, but let's say that there is a kind of mode of awareness or experience that is non-conceptual and non-dual. So that means it's a mode of awareness or experience that's not bifurcated into a sense of subject over against object, subject versus object, and it's also not conceptual in the sense that you're not applying constructed categories to the experience. So now if you if you say, well, in cognitive science terms, what exactly would that be? Because perception is inherently applying constructed categories. Then that gets tricky, because the words concepts and categories might not be
maybe we're not saying the same thing anymore.
Exactly the same way. But if you wanted to put it in cognitive science terms, you would have to say something like, even within cognitive science, there's a recognized distinction between, let's say, we could put it this way, between a kind of analog sensory content that's, continuous, and that might involve, being able to make discriminations, but that doesn't involve categorical chunking and recognition over time.
Sort of elaboration of concepts.
Exactly. So this is significant, actually, to connect to studies of meditation in science. This is actually quite interesting and significant in the neuroscience and meditation of pain experience. Because pain, in the way we use the English word pain, is this complex constructed thing. It has a sensory aspect, it has an affective aspect, it has a cognitive aspect. And certain forms of meditation that are not so much concentration practices, but more kind of open awareness practices, seem to have very powerful effects, both behaviorally and neurally, on the perception and experience of pain. The idea basically being that there's a kind of open, you might say, non-grasping, that is neither desiring nor being aversively oriented to, a kind of non-grasping openness towards the pain stimulus, without then superimposing onto it all the affective cognitive elaboration. And that goes along with actually a very accurate ability to discriminate the sensory intensity of pain, with a reduced report of unpleasantness, and a reduction in brain areas that are associated with kind of affective appraisal. So there's a case where with cognitive science and with certain meditative traditions, and I think this is a good example of the science-Buddhism interface in the lab, if you will. There's an attempt to kind of parse out these different aspects of pain in a way that could actually then have very beneficial, non-pharmacological, therapy methods for dealing with pain, especially chronic pain. So that, I think, is really good. But notice there that research is strong because there's already a very well-developed theory of pain in cognitive neuroscience and neurophysiology. So it's not like we're just going and measuring, meditators and scanners in this kind of way that doesn't involve a larger theory about, what the mind is and how the mind works. We're actually taking a very developed area of scientific research, and we're saying, oh, look, these practices actually seem to affect the experience of pain. So that's a case where I think there is some very good research, very important research.
A few steps back in our conversation today, you were saying something about the problem with pulling something out of its context and then trying to look at it. Did you mean specifically that there's a problem with us pulling, for instance, mindfulness out of the bigger context, or pulling the meditator up and out of the community context? Because if it's pulling the meditator up and out of the context, I'm hopeful that maybe our neuroscience can start including things. I mean, today with hyperscanning is a kind of interesting thing that's been going on where we're able to watch multiple brains together. I know I'm in conversations with some labs who are interested to see sort of teacher-student relationships in meditation situations where we're sort of watching how different people entrain one another, or in places where ritual or sort of ecstatic prayer community states where we're able to actually monitor or watch people in real-world environments. But of course, that doesn't help you if what we mean the problem is drawing mindfulness out of the context, because I do think we're doing that as well.
Yeah, I really mean both, actually. So, mindfulness, what happens with mindfulness in our culture a lot of the time, not always, of course, is that it gets not just decontextualized from the larger framework of Buddhism, it gets recontextualized in a way that emphasizes, individualism and consumerism. So I don't really have a problem with secularizing certain aspects of mindfulness practice in the way that's being done with mindfulness-based cognitive therapy or mindfulness-based stress reduction. I mean, those are important therapies. They benefit a lot of people. You know, I don't see anything inherently wrong with that at all. What is problematic is when that then gets folded into a recontextualization in terms of basically late-stage capitalism, where you have a kind of, you know, individualist, consumerist conception of how the person relates to society, both factually and normatively. There, I think we get a reinforcement of our own sort of inbuilt cultural narcissism that I just think kind of is self-perpetuating and feeds a kind of, you know, you could say sickness of our culture. So it's presented as if it's a cure, but it's actually a kind of panacea, and it reinforces a deeper sickness. So that would be one point about mindfulness.
Sorry, just before you go on, can you just say one more thing? What is it about the sort of maybe McMindfulness movement that you see is feeding into this capitalistic idea? What was the exact point there?
Oh, the point there is that, you know, people, for example, suffer from stress and anxiety, and they're told to practice mindfulness in the Amazon workplace or in their office cubicle. And that's just like, it might help them a little bit, but that's not the problem that they're facing. I mean, the problem they're facing is they're exploited and, you know, they're not valued and they're degraded. And you're telling them it's just a problem inside them that they can cure through their own private practice of mindfulness. So
being
that's
used as a kind of opioid for the masses to make you not rebel against conditions that should be changed. The condition should be changed. Not you should get better at taking abusive conditions.
Right. Exactly.
Got it.
But the other point about social neuroscience, I mean, I think a lot of looking at coupled brain rhythms, you know, enlarging the frame to include not just coupled brain rhythms, but, you know, a larger embodied perspective of, you know, the brain and the heart and other physiological processes and markers. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, but I think the danger, nonetheless, is a kind of reification where you then think that because you're looking at the biological side of things, that you've actually fastened on to what the reality of those things is. Whereas I see the biological things as conditions or elements in a larger phenomenon, where the conditions and elements should not be identified with the phenomenon. They should be seen as kind of enabling factors for it.
So at best you can say this is what the brain, body, and environment look like when you're having these kinds of experiences. But that's as much as we can say. We can say, well, look, those are the states.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Evan, I'm interested in, I can't work out basically what you're committed to when it comes to the funky stuff, the Enlightenment.
Yeah, this is a good topic.
Like my understanding of Enlightenment, and there's obviously a bunch of forms, but I think basically what people mean is you realize, so it's kind of the epistemology thing again, some fundamental truth about yourself, nature, bang, permanent change of experience. I can't work out whether you're committed to cool bullshit on that epistemology point, or whether you can kind of run with it. And I just wanted you to clear it up.
Yeah. Okay. So
that's a big question.
It's a good question. So I would say that I have no doubt that people experience, you know, profound transformative experiences that they may then use the word awakening or enlightenment to describe, and that involves a transformation in certain modes of understanding, and you could say certain modes of knowing, though we would need to say more about that. It certainly always goes along with an epistemic feeling of knowing, a kind of like noetic feeling of insight. The point that I argue in my book about that is that the notion of enlightenment or awakening is the notion of an enlightenment or awakening experience is concept dependent, in the sense that the idea of love is concept dependent. So there isn't, you know, one thing called love. there's, there's romantic love, there's sibling love, there's love for a pet, there's, divine love, there's medieval courtly love. I mean, what love is as a human experience always depends on how you conceptualize it. The conceptualization makes it be the kind of experience that warrants being called love in one or another mode. So I would say the same about awakening or enlightenment. There are many, many transformative experiences that people have, and when they get labeled as awakening or enlightenment, they're getting conceptualized. And that conceptualization actually makes the experience is part of what makes the experience have a certain kind of significance. So now if you ask me, okay, so yeah, I'm going to go along with all that. There's no like such thing as a, enlightenment or awakening experience outside of being conceptualized as such. What then do we say about the epistemic claims that people make? Well, that depends on the particular epistemic claim. So if someone, for example, were to say, I've had a profound transformative awakening in which I realized that there fundamentally is no self, and that the nature of consciousness is pure awareness, pure luminosity, and that is the ground state of all being, that reality is, let's say, consciousness, then I would say there's been an unwarranted move from a description of an experiential realization that has transformed the person to metaphysical statements about reality that don't logically follow, and that epistemically are not warranted because, you could put it this way, being or consciousness is ultimately ungraspable. I mean, you can't trace out from within where its origin is and what its fundamental nature is. And you actually can't trace from the outside either what its origin or its fundamental nature is. I mean, it's like you can do ever more refined neuroscience investigations of consciousness, and there will remain the fact that any examination of the brain is as the brain as showing up as a perceptual object within the horizon of consciousness. So you never step outside consciousness and track it down to something that's fundamentally not consciousness or that's outside of consciousness. So that's from the outside. From within, you can go down the rabbit hole deep experientially, but you can never see the underlying generative source of that, despite what one or another tradition might claim. At least that's my own view. So there's a way that it always escapes, and wherever you are, you're sort of thrown back in the loop. It's like an Escher engraving, You're sort of like you're viewing the painting in the gallery, and then you're thrown into the depiction, and it's a depiction of you that feeds back into you as looking at the picture, and there's no way out of that.
So when you hear like Sam Harris, right, say the feeling of seeing no self as a truth, it's like seeing a snake and then you see it's a rope. And like, it's just obvious to you that you can't go back now to thinking it's a snake, it's a rope. You basically say that doesn't extend to the metaphysical claim about the nature of existence or the nature of the self. That's just a claim about how it feels. And inevitably you're stuck in this loop where you can't actually trace it.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the snake rope analogy is one where, you've got this kind of like horizon of your consciousness, this vista that's sort of horizontally bounded of your consciousness, and you see something, and you like jump back and think it's a snake, but then you realize it's a rope, and so you never respond to that thing in the same way again. You realize, oh, it's really a rope, and it's also susceptible, given a certain mindset, to being sort of having superimposed on it a snake. That's a sort of evolution in your experience. But the idea that you could, on the basis of that kind of evolution, then claim that you have exhausted the depths of reality such that there could never be any further revision or alteration or openness, that it could turn out experientially you hit a limit and there's no further, openness or depth. There's actually some technical arguments in Advaita Vedanta for why that has to be the case. But it still doesn't, at least as I see it, warrant the statement that you have plumbed the depths of reality, because that's a perspective, if you will, from within. But that doesn't tell you anything about the Big Bang, the evolution of biological life, the nature of disease, viruses. I mean, there's just all sorts of things that perspective just doesn't give you access to.
Is it a mistake here between thinking that these things are going to solve metaphysical claims rather than soteriological ones again? I mean to say, like, we don't need to necessarily we don't need to take on the metaphysical baggage in order to get well from those insights. Rather than saying, oh, well, I've had this experience, therefore all of reality must be consciousness. I mean, even in the tradition, was it ever meant to be a sort of metaphysical step? Because most of the time when I'm reading Buddhism, I really hear the soteriological direction. It's not about trying to figure out what's real out in the world. Rather, it's about getting the arrows out of your heart in a way, right? That's supposed to be helping you overcome your suffering.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of going. I would say that, many traditions in Buddhism do make very interesting, metaphysical claims that
right.
That actually, have a lot of, very interesting aspects of them. But I don't think if you look at them from the outside, as it were, you see that what's going on in them it's not like a direct readout of personal meditative experience. It has to do with an ongoing kind of hermeneutics of scripture and debates about different interpretation and the evolution of different schools with different understandings of practice. And all of that is very much, bound up in it. I think in the modern context today, not everybody, but you do see this in the sort of, spirituality without religion kind of milieu in which we live. You see, many teachers who make statements about reality on the basis of, you could say, certain kinds of, profound meditative insights that I just think are that don't follow from the experiential insights that they've had. So that's more what I was talking about.
Yeah, and the fundamental bit there that's underlying your argument sounds like, look, you can have these experiential experiences, but just the nature of the experience you're having doesn't give you any further information on the problem you're trying to solve, which is metaphysical.
Yeah, I mean, here's an example. So, everything in your experience, whether you're awake and acutely perceiving, whether you're mind wandering, whether you're daydreaming, whether you're falling asleep, whether you're having a dream, whether you're having a lucid dream, whether you're having an out-of-body experience, whether you're having a near-death experience, like take the whole gamut. None of that, as experienced, tells you anything about the fact that you have a brain and that things are happening in the brain when these experiences happen. You would never know that from the first person perspective, right? Similarly, when you examine the brain and all its complexity and profundity, you always are doing so with the brain as an object within the horizon of observational perceptual consciousness. So my point again is you can go down either rabbit hole and eventually it's going to spit you back out into the other one, but you're never going to be able to get outside of that loop and say, now I've really nailed it. Now I know what reality fundamentally is. Even to be really mind-bendy about it, even if you say, oh, reality is just a loop. I mean, you can try to go up to a meta level and say that, but then you're just going to be another, in another kind of twist of the Mobius strip. So that's, I mean, this is heady metaphysical philosophy stuff, but it's fun. But that's kind of how I see it, if you really want to ask the sort of fundamental metaphysical questions.
That's quite an unsexy answer, though, right? Because the Enlightenment...
Really?
Well, Well, it's sexy in as far as the heady metaphysics is sexy.
Okay, good.
It's unsexy in as far as if you're in the game, and I think lots of people are, as a psychological resource.
Yeah.
And I'm speaking about myself in the past tense here. You look at something like Buddhism or Enlightenment and go, that sounds great.
Yeah, sure.
That thing over there sounds great. And in some ways, in order for you to buy the fact it would be so great, you need the metaphysics. Because without the metaphysics...
Sure.
I
mean, I get that. Of course, I get that. I've been there myself, so I totally understand that feeling. But I think so. Some people aren't interested in the metaphysics at all, or they just like they're interested in it because it makes a tangible difference to their life. And the bigger metaphysical story is sort of like, well, that's maybe not why I'm here. It's interesting, but that's not why I'm here. So that's fine. That's totally fine. If you get drawn into the bigger metaphysical story and you're trying to figure things out, then I think you kind of have to be honest, and you have to like follow the argument where it leads. And I mean, that has its own kind of compelling aesthetics. So that's what I would say to somebody. I would say, look, okay, you're going down that path. Then be rigorous about it. Commit yourself to it, and don't try to just shut it down and script it prematurely.
That feels like the remedy for loads of our ills today. The people should be taking philosophy, I think, sort of pervasively, right? That you should learn to be critical thinkers, to think through your belief systems and to think where your beliefs came from and where did you take leaps of logic and were they good leaps and why did you take those leaps? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
the difficulty is, right, and like anyone who spent any time around practicing Buddhists or practicing meditators will know, everyone, I'm projecting a little bit, but goes in with a certain psychological outcome they have in mind. Mm-hmm. And the step, to go, I'm going to follow the logic here, really, and work out where I'm sort of making these leaps or where does the experience not account for the metaphysics. I think people struggle with that because it doesn't seem to answer the problem that they're actually wanting solved, which is anxiety is tough, or this emotional problem would be resolved if I got this imagined thing. So it's where it's so important to have this message come through in these groups, to go, let's just be honest about the reasoning we're making here. Because without that message coming on top, it's very easy, and as I say, I'm projecting past tense, to make the leaps that you want to make emotionally.
Yeah, I understand that. I mean, I think... the reasons people are often drawn into these things typically is, not so much these larger metaphysical questions, but, more immediate felt needs. And I don't want to, deny the value and importance of that at all. But I do think that if you're thinking of it as a path of wisdom and a path of self-knowledge, then you're selling yourself short if you don't, kind of plumb the depths. And it doesn't mean that you have to, I don't see this as, I'm not arguing against the value of locating yourself within a tradition and committing yourself to that tradition. I have no quarrel with that. I think that's fine. But I think it is important not to do that in a way that involves a kind of distorted understanding or false consciousness of what these larger questions, entail.
Yeah. And then, to some large degree, enter cosmopolitanism. Can you characterize what you mean when you say cosmopolitanism?
Yeah. So cosmopolitanism is a term that it's an ancient philosophical term. It goes back to the Greeks, and we see analog ideas in South Asian philosophical traditions, East Asian philosophical traditions, and it's basically the idea that that humanity is one family, and that one should identify with humanity as such in a way that at the same time values difference, local traditions, local communities, and the welfare of those who participate in them. And so there's a philosophical discussion over many centuries, from the Greeks down into the Enlightenment, up to today, about cosmopolitanism as a kind of ethical worldview. And the reason it comes up for me is mainly as a way of reframing the science Buddhism dialogue. In Why I'm Not a Buddhist, I talk about how the science-Buddhism dialogue in some of its early forms in the 20th century, it was really conceived as a kind of cosmopolitan dialogue about the ethics of knowledge in the way that we were talking about earlier. And this was really coming out of Francisco Varela's thinking, the founding scientist of the Mind and Life Institute, who was also a very pioneering neurobiologist and neuroscientist and theoretical biologist, and a committed Tibetan Buddhist. So in his early dialogues with the Dalai Lama that then became the Mind and Life Dialogues, the idea was always that there are these two different traditions of knowledge and practice, science and Buddhism, with different lineages within them. And the larger context is the ethics of knowledge. And the aim of the conversation is not to use science to justify Buddhism or use Buddhism to embellish science. The aim is really to get to know one another with mutual respect and to enrich one another. And cosmopolitanism, Varela didn't really use the word cosmopolitanism, but in effect what he was describing is what cosmopolitanism is as a philosophical stance or philosophical orientation. So you can be a Buddhist and be a cosmopolitanist at the same time. It doesn't, I mean, there's this perception sometimes that cosmopolitanism involves this sort of like rootless, wandering, with no fixed abode and no fixed home and no tradition. And I think that, I mean, even that can be its own tradition in a way. There are individuals who are like that, and there's a tradition of thinking, of being like that. But it mainly comes from a perspective that happens when traditions encounter each other, and people have multiple commitments to different traditions. I mean, people are Buddhists, people are scientists and Buddhists. And I experienced, particularly through the work that I did for many years in the Mind and Life Institute, this tendency sometimes for people who were scientists and Buddhists, or scientists and meditators, they didn't necessarily have to be Buddhists, to think that the way to put those things together was to use the science to legitimize their meditation practice or legitimize their identification with Buddhism, because Buddhism is the scientific religion after all. And so I'm saying, no, that's not the right way to think about it. The right way to think about it is more like you have an ecosystem with biodiversity. So you have many different species, and a healthy ecosystem has many, many, many different species. And so our culture is healthy when there are, different religious traditions, different, ways of thinking about and doing science, different forms of art and artistic practice, and not where science becomes the one, framework of thinking that then determines the value or the reality of the others. So that's cosmopolitanism in a nutshell.
I just don't know how you can say anything bad about that. That just sounds dead on to me. I feel very comfortable with that idea. I mean, in cognitive science, it's very much the same. Even though we debate between various approaches to what the mind is, you don't want to collapse. I don't think it's valuable to collapse down to one view of the mind. It's healthy to have lots of different research projects and different strains, because then we create friction between each other and we enrich each other by that friction.
Right.
Yeah.
I wonder what the practicality of this all is for scientists who want to study contemplative matters. Is there some way of implementing kind of your set of arguments here to make sure they're doing good science, especially around Buddhism? Yeah.
I think there is, but I think it's difficult in the present scientific culture, which is driven a lot by, the hierarchy of publication and prestige journals and getting grants and funding and, all of that. But the reason it's difficult is because it needs to go, in a sense, it needs to be slower and more multifaceted in the way that it pursues the research. So, for example, I think in the case of studying meditation, that every lab should have an anthropologist and a science studies person as part of the team. So the anthropologist is someone who understands the social context of meditation and the practices and rituals that go into configuring it. And the science studies person is someone who is there to document and record how the scientific lab itself is constructing the object that it's investigating. I mean, by constructing, I mean, conceptually configuring it and reconfiguring it according to what they can operationalize and how certain scientific technologies frame how we think about the phenomena that we're studying. I mean, this is especially evident in fMRI and the whole idea of brain mapping and you could even say mind mapping through fMRI. So then you also need people who are skilled in eliciting and interpreting self-reports, because, I mean, in the case of meditation, meditation is complicated because there's what the meditation teacher or text, as embodied through a teacher, says you're supposed to be doing. And then there's what you yourself understand you should be doing. And then there's what you yourself are actually doing. And then there's what you yourself is reporting on what you're doing. All of this being, framed within, say, the context of a lab, or maybe if it's a more ecological mode of investigation in a social setting. So you need people who have expertise into seeing all these loops. If you just kind of remove all that and you focus on here's a brain measure, there are brain effects for sure, but you're not doing justice to the complexity of the phenomenon that you're studying. So it means you just need a much more, I won't even say interdisciplinary, I will say transdisciplinary research team. And that kind of research, it takes time. It's not something you can just, spit out a quick publication where you have a biomarker for something and then boom, you land it in, a journal and you get your Google citations and then, you list them on the grant. I mean, so it's an uphill battle, but I think more of that, and this is happening. I think, the scientists who I think are, at least according to my estimation, the ones doing, the better research on these topics, I mean, they have an awareness of this and they do try to move the field in this direction, at least, incrementally, if not all at one go.
Yeah.
Evan, I appreciate you being here. That was a lot of fun. I have to say, I could have used some of this, I think, 5 years ago.
Well, it's never too late.
Yeah, that's right.
But 5 years later, this has been excellent. Thank you, mate, for coming on, really.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Evan.
Great.
Okay.
Listen, wherever you've been listening to that was Professor Evan Thompson. And Evan, just before we let you go, where can everyone find you?
So if you just Google Evan Thompson, my my web pages will come up at University of British Columbia, and then my own personal web page. If you're somebody who uses Twitter, I'm on Twitter. My emails are listed at the UBC site and my personal site if someone wants to contact me that way.
Great.
Awesome. Well, listen, thank you so much for listening, and as always, we'll see you next week.